If you type banned SpongeBob episode into a search bar, you'll get somewhere around 40 results, and roughly one of them is actually true. That gap is the whole reason I wanted to make this video, because there is exactly one episode that Nickelodeon genuinely took off the air and left off the air. Everything else in the banned pile is something else. A deleted scene, an episode people hated so much they wrote petitions about it. A study that got badly misreported, a paper nobody read past the headline, or a man who never said the thing everyone remembers him saying. So that's what we're doing tonight. Episodes, cutscenes, a psychology study, an anthropology journal, a couple of governments, and a fair bit of grief. All about a cartoon sponge who works at a burger restaurant. Nothing here needs your full attention. Drift off whenever. If you like this sort of thing, subscribing genuinely helps. Let's start with the swearing one. You already know the sound, everyone does. That bright little dolphin chirp that drops in over a word you never actually hear. It's been a meme for longer than some of the people watching this have been alive, and it's one of those bits of the show that's escaped SpongeBob entirely. People use it in conversation now as a sound effect in real life, without necessarily remembering where it came from. It came from an episode called Sailor Mouth, which aired on the 21st of September, 2001. The setup is about as simple as this show gets. SpongeBob takes the rubbish out to the back of the Krusty Krab and reads the graffiti on the dumpster. One of the messages says, "Krabs is A," and then a word he doesn't recognise, which the audience hears as a dolphin noise. He repeats it to Patrick. Patrick, being Patrick, informs him with total confidence that it's a sentence enhancer, a thing refined people use in refined conversation. And off they go, dropping it into every sentence they can manage, until the entire town of Bikini Bottom is looking at them like they've lost their minds. The reason this one's worth talking about at all is what sits underneath that noise, and I find it genuinely great. The dolphin noise wasn't a creative flourish, it was a compromise. Steven Hillenburg talked about this years later, in 2016, and he was pretty blunt about it. He pitched the idea that SpongeBob and Patrick learn a swear word, and everyone said no. Not tone it down, not be careful with it, no. And then he wasn't even allowed to use a bleep, because a bleep implies a real word underneath it, and a real word underneath it was a problem. So he used a dolphin instead, which means the single most iconic gag in the episode, arguably one of the most recognisable sound cues in the entire show, exists purely because the network wouldn't let him do the normal version. I love that. Restrictions do that sometimes. You get told no, and the workaround turns out better than the thing you originally wanted. There's a detail underneath that which makes it even better. Tom Kenny, who voices SpongeBob, has said the cast actually recorded real dialogue in those gaps. They improvised fake profanities, knowing full well the sound effects would go over the top later. He's described laughing so hard during the session that he ended up recording lines while lying on the floor of the booth, which means an uncensored version of Sailor Mouth technically exists, or existed. Nobody outside the production has ever heard it, and it's now sat firmly in the lost media category, which is a whole world of the internet where people spend genuinely enormous amounts of effort trying to track down things like this. I'll be honest, I don't think it's ever coming out, but I do like knowing it's somewhere. Now, the controversy part. The Parents Television Council took a look at Sailor Mouth and came away with the view that the episode was promoting and satirising the use of profanity to children. Their concern, broadly, was that kids would watch two characters have an enormous amount of fun, swearing for 11 minutes, and draw the obvious conclusion. I want to be fair to that argument, because it isn't stupid on its face. The episode is very funny about swearing. The characters enjoy it. There's a whole sequence where Mr. Krabs reels off the full list of forbidden words, and Squidward, who I maintain is the only character in that show with a functioning brain, asks whether he means there are only 7. That's a George Carlin reference in a children's cartoon. aimed at an audience that would not get it for another 15 years. So yes, the episode is having a good time with the topic. That's not really in dispute. Where I part ways with the objection is that the episode is also, quite plainly, about learning that you shouldn't. SpongeBob and Patrick get told off. They feel bad, they try to stop. Then Mr. Krabs turns out to be the worst offender of the lot, which is the actual joke. The adult telling everyone off is the one with the filthiest vocabulary. It's not a subtle moral. It's about as heavy-handed as a moral can be. Hillenburg's own explanation, which he gave to the Washington Post, was that the writers pulled storylines out of their own childhoods. His example was literally this episode. A kid learns a swear word and doesn't know what it means. He described it as a classic thing all kids go through, and he's right. Everyone reading this had that moment. Everyone had the follow-up moment where an adult's face changed and you realised you'd made a mistake. Sort of like how your mum could tell instantly that you'd learned something from someone else's older brother. There's one more thing about the censorship in this episode that I think gets missed. The show doesn't use one sound. It uses a whole range of them: dolphin chirps, foghorns, seal barks, various nautical noises. And because it varies, the show quietly implies something quite funny, which is that these might not be censorship at all. In Bikini Bottom, those might just be what the swear words sound like. The joke is doing two things at once, and it never stops to point either of them out. I think that's the reason this episode has aged as well as it has. It's built out of very careful choices that never announce themselves. A quick fun detail, because it says something about how long the show has been circling this bit. In 2019, for the 20th anniversary special, there's a scene where a tour guide runs through a list of rules, one of which is no bad language, and SpongeBob and Patrick immediately break it. 18 years later, and they're still going. Whether there's real dialogue under that one too, nobody's saying. The uncensored tape got mentioned again at a comic convention panel in 2021. Still, nobody's heard it. There's a structural thing about this episode I want to point out, because I think it explains why it survived when other episodes from the same period didn't age nearly as well. The whole 11 minutes is built on a single misunderstanding, and the show is completely disciplined about it. SpongeBob doesn't know what the word means. He never finds out what it means. Neither does Patrick. Neither, crucially, does the audience. You're never given even a hint, because there's nothing under the dolphin noise except a sound effect and a joke, which means the episode can be about swearing without ever containing any swearing in any meaningful sense. It's about the social effect of the word rather than the word itself. Every gag is somebody else's face. The bin man's disgust. The customer whose food freezes halfway to his mouth. The entire restaurant going silent. The comedy is entirely in the reactions of people who do understand, watching two characters who don't. That's quite a clever bit of writing for a show that was, at that point, 2 years old. And it means the episode has a very unusual property, which is that it plays differently depending on how old you are, without changing at all. Watch it at 7 and it's two idiots making a funny noise. Watch it at 27 and it's about the specific horror of a child repeating something in public that they all picked up somewhere and don't understand. The second version is much funnier and also slightly more uncomfortable, because most of us were that child. A small thing before we go, and it's a bit of trivia I'm quite fond of. The episode gets discussed by Tom Kenny in an interview that ran in a newspaper in May of 2001, several months before the episode actually premiered in America. Which is a slightly odd sequence of events, the cast talking publicly about an episode nobody had seen yet, in an era well before the modern promotional machine, in print. That's the sort of detail that only surfaces because fans went digging through archives years later. I keep coming back to the fact that the network's restriction is the reason this episode is remembered. If Nickelodeon had simply said, "Fine, use a bleep," we'd have a perfectly serviceable episode about swearing that nobody would think about very much. Instead, a note from standards and practices produced a sound effect that outlived the show's original run, escaped into general use, and became the way an entire generation refers to censored language. Nobody planned that. Nobody could have. One more thought on the Parents Television Council side of this, because I don't want to be glib about it. Watchdog groups get an easy kicking in videos like this one, and I've probably contributed to that a bit already. But their basic function isn't unreasonable. Someone should be paying attention to what's being marketed to children. Networks are commercial operations with commercial incentives, and somebody outside the building is watching is a genuinely useful pressure to have in the system, even when the specific complaints are daft. The problem is that they're extremely bad at distinguishing between a show that's careless and a show that's making a point. And this episode is very obviously making a point. It's about consequences. It's about learning where the line is. If you were designing a piece of children's television to teach a child that swearing in public gets you in trouble, you would come out with something remarkably close to this. But you can only see that if you watch the whole thing, and complaints about media are very often made by people working from a clip, which, if you've been following along, is going to come up again. And again, it's the single most consistent pattern in this entire video. Anyway, a network telling the crew what couldn't be shown is a running theme in all this. And it's not always the sound that gets changed. Sometimes it's the picture, and sometimes the thing that gets changed just disappears entirely, which is where we're going next. There's a very particular feeling that comes with remembering a scene that isn't in the episode anymore. You go back to rewatch something you loved as a kid. You're waiting for a bit, you know the bit, you can picture it, and the episode just walks straight past it, cuts to something else, carries on as though nothing's missing, and for a second you genuinely wonder whether you made the whole thing up. Loads of people have had that exact experience with an episode called Just One Bite. It first aired on the 5th of October 2001 as part of a Nickelodeon programming block. The plot's a good one. Squidward finally tries a Krabby Patty, discovers he loves it, and then spirals into the kind of obsession that ends with him breaking into the restaurant at night to raid the vault. In the original version, before he gets to the vault, he trips the security system. He sees a bucket, assumes it's water, kicks the door open and spills it. Then he sniffs it and realises it isn't water at all. A mechanical arm drops a lit match. And it happens twice, because the kitchen has a second one. That's about 40 seconds of screen time. And by 2002, barely 3 months after the episode first aired, it was gone. For roughly 20 years, the internet's explanation for this was 9/11. The episode aired less than a month after the attacks, at a point when American broadcasters were pulling, delaying, and re-editing a genuinely enormous amount of material. And the theory made a reasonable amount of sense on the surface. A big explosion, a burning building, a character running out injured. You can see how people got there. Then in June of 2018, Vincent Waller, who has been the show's showrunner for years and is generally the person fans go to when they want a straight answer about this stuff, cleared it up. It was a standards and practices decision. Nickelodeon didn't want a gag built around a match and a bucket of petrol because the concern was children copying it, which is, when you think about it, an infinitely more boring explanation and also a completely reasonable one. That is a very copyable stunt. Every other deleted scene mystery I've looked into has some elaborate story behind it. This one is just fire safety. What makes it genuinely interesting rather than just trivia is the geography. The scene didn't vanish everywhere. It vanished in some places. Canadian broadcasts kept it. It aired on YTV and Nickelodeon Canada uncut for years. South Korean airings on EBS have it dubbed. Serbian broadcasts have it. Bulgarian ones. Hong Kong airings. Meanwhile, every American airing, every DVD, every VHS, the iTunes version, Amazon, Paramount Plus, all the edited cuts where the camera simply glides through the window to the vault and the whole sequence never happens. So there's an entire generation of Canadian kids who grew up with a slightly different version of this episode than everyone else, and who spent years being told by Americans on the internet that they'd imagined it. I find that genuinely charming. Not the scene is fine, it's 40 seconds of a squid getting blown up twice, but the fact that a piece of a children's cartoon can exist in two different states, depending on which country's transmitter you happen to be near. The preservation effort around it is a bit ridiculous, in the best way. People have gone digging through old recordings, foreign dubs, discontinued streaming services. There's a version circulating in extremely high resolution. Someone did that. Someone sat down and did the work to get 40 seconds of Squidward on fire looking as good as it possibly could. And that's more restoration effort than a lot of actual short films will ever receive. No notes. Since we're on the subject of things that got cut, there's another one worth mentioning, and this one never even made it off the page. FUN is the episode where SpongeBob decides Plankton just needs a friend, and it's one of the most genuinely sweet things the show ever did. The song is properly good. The ending is a bit sad in a way the show didn't usually do that early on. There was a joke in the storyboards for that episode involving Plankton holding the jellyfishing net like it was a gun, making shooting noises and asking what happens after they shoot them. SpongeBob's reaction was horror, so the joke was landing on the right side of it, Plankton being alarming, SpongeBob being appalled. It never got made. The episode was in production a few months after Columbine, and there was never any realistic chance a children's network was putting that on air in that particular year. That one I don't think anybody would argue with. Last one, and I want to handle it carefully because it's a rumour rather than a fact. There's a story that circulates constantly about Rock Bottom, the episode where SpongeBob gets stranded in the trench and can't catch a bus home. The claim is that there was a deleted scene where he runs up the near vertical road and falls, landing in a pool of blood. I've looked at this one properly, and I can't find anything solid underneath it. It comes up on forums, gets repeated again, and at no point does anyone produce a source. No footage, no crew statement, no listing. As far as I can tell, it belongs firmly in the myth pile, alongside about a dozen other lost SpongeBob scene stories that turn out to be somebody's half memory that got out of hand. Which is a thing I gently say about this whole topic actually. A lot of what circulates about this show is fans' speculation that hardened into fact through sheer repetition. The gasoline scene is real and well documented. The gun gag is real and well documented. Quite a lot of the rest isn't. While we're here, it's worth saying something about why so many of these stories exist in the first place, because it isn't really about SpongeBob. Children's television in the late 1990s and early 2000s was made under a set of rules that were being rewritten constantly and mostly in private. Standards and practices departments exist at every network. They employ actual people, and those people are making judgment calls all day about things that have no obvious right answer. Can a character light a match? Can a character say a word that sounds like a word? Can a character be on fire for 2 seconds, or is 1 second the limit? Those calls don't get published. There's no register of them. So what fans end up with, 20 years later, is a set of visible effects. A missing 40 seconds here, a strange cut there, with all the reasoning stripped out. And when you've got an effect with no explanation attached, people will supply one. That's just what people do, which is how a fire safety note becomes a 9/11 conspiracy for 2 decades. I'd also gently point out that Vincent Waller answering a fan's question on social media in 2018 is genuinely how a lot of this stuff gets resolved now. There's no archive to consult. The only reliable source is a person who was in the building at the time and whether they happen to feel like answering. That's a slightly precarious way for a show's history to be preserved, and I think it explains why the fandom around this particular programme is so unusually forensic. When the official record is that thin, people build their own. There's another category of missing footage worth mentioning quickly, and it's the least dramatic one, which is why nobody talks about it. Episodes get trimmed for time constantly. When a broadcaster needs more advert space, or when a syndication package has a different runtime target, seconds come out, usually reaction shots, held beats, the little pauses that make a joke land. And nobody notices because a missing pause doesn't leave a hole the way a missing explosion does. So there are versions of these episodes circulating that are quietly a bit worse than the originals, purely for scheduling reasons, and no one has ever written an angry forum post about it because there's nothing obvious to point at. I think about that more than is probably healthy. One last thing on the international angle, because I think it's the genuinely underrated part of all this. We tend to talk about television as though there's one version of a show and everybody sees it. There isn't. There never has been. Every territory that broadcasts a programme is running its own version, with its own dub, its own edits, its own standards, body making its own calls about what's acceptable. Some of those differences are enormous. Whole scenes go in some countries, character names change, jokes get rewritten wholesale because a pun that works in English is just a sentence in Portuguese, and someone in a booth in Sao Paulo has to invent a new joke that fits the mouth movements. That last bit is a genuinely underappreciated craft, by the way. Dub writers on this show in particular have had an absolute nightmare of a job for 20-odd years, because the humour is so heavily built on wordplay and on sounds. The French version had to deal with the sentence enhancers business and find something that still made sense. The Serrani dub apparently made changes to a counting sequence for reasons that only make sense in that language. So the idea of a single, canonical version of any episode is a bit of a fiction. There's an American one, and then there are dozens of others, and the differences between them are largely invisible unless you happen to grow up in two of them, which occasionally produces genuinely lovely internet moments. Someone posting a clip they remember perfectly well, getting told it doesn't exist, and eventually being vindicated by somebody in another country going, "Oh, that's the version we had." Anyway, everything up to now has been a scene. A few seconds trimmed here and there. There's exactly one episode that got the full treatment, and it's a strange one. Out of hundreds of episodes, across more than 20 years, one is genuinely, permanently gone. Not trimmed, not edited, not quietly swapped for a different version. Taken out of rotation entirely and left there, with no plan to bring it back. It's a season 3 episode called Midlife Crustacean, and it first aired in 2003. The plot is straightforward, and for the most part, quite good. Mr. Krabs is having a midlife crisis. He's feeling old, he's feeling irrelevant, he catches sight of himself, and doesn't much like what he sees. SpongeBob and Patrick decide the fix is to take him out for a night and remind him he can still have a good time. Most of that night is exactly what you'd expect. It's silly. The joke is that SpongeBob and Patrick's idea of a wild night out is completely unhinged and also completely harmless, and Mr. Krabs is far too old for any of it. Then there's the panty raid. For anyone who doesn't know the term, and I suspect that's most people watching this, a panty raid was a real American college prank, popular roughly between the 1940s and the 1960s, where a group of male students would break into a women's dormitory and steal underwear. It was a whole thing. It made newspapers at the time. It's the sort of prank that gets referenced in old films and sitcoms as shorthand for youthful mischief. In the episode, Patrick suggests it. The three of them break into a house and take underwear, and then it turns out the house belongs to Mr. Krabs' mother, who catches them and sends her adult son to his childhood bedroom, which is genuinely a good punchline. That's the scene. That's the whole thing. And for 15 years, it aired without incident, constantly. If you grew up watching reruns in the 2000s, you almost certainly saw it several times, probably without registering anything unusual about it, because a lot of the joke goes over your head at 8 years old, and what's left is a crab getting told off by his mum. Then in 2018, Nickelodeon pulled it. And here's the odd bit. They didn't announce anything. There was no statement, no press release, no removal notice. The episode just stopped appearing. Nobody outside the network really noticed until 2021, when IGN spotted that both this episode and another one had disappeared from streaming services and asked what had happened. Nickelodeon's answer was that Midlife Crustacean had been out of rotation since 2018 following a standards review, in which they determined some story elements were not appropriate for children. That's the entire official explanation. Standards review. Some story elements. IGN went back and asked the obvious follow-ups. Which specific content triggered it? Did the network consider an advisory or a content warning instead of removing the episode outright? The response was no comment. I go back and forth on this one, genuinely. On one hand, the joke doesn't work now. It just doesn't. Whatever it was doing in 2003 as a reference to a 50-year-old college prank, that framing is dead. Nobody watching it today has the context that made it read as harmlessly retro, so what's left is 3 characters breaking into a woman's house and taking her underwear. I understand entirely why somebody sat in a review meeting and thought, no, we're not doing this one anymore. On the other hand, the silence bothers me a bit. The episode existed, millions of people watched it. Deleting it without saying anything, and then declining to explain when asked directly, isn't really a decision, it's an absence of one. A content warning is a decision. Quietly removing something and hoping nobody asks is a different thing. I don't think that's some enormous moral failing. It's a corporation managing a children's brand, and there's no version of this where they publish a detailed memo about it. But the no comment does stick with me. There's a good footnote to all this. In 2023, the episode briefly reappeared on Paramount+. Not deliberately, reportedly a technical error. It sat there for a short window before somebody noticed and pulled it back down, which tells you the file still exists. It's in the system. Someone just has a flag set on it. That's the honest version of most of these stories, I think. We tend to talk about controversial episodes as though something went wrong in the writer's room. Usually, nothing went wrong in the writer's room. The episode simply outlived the moment it was written for, which is a thing that happens to absolutely everything eventually. Here's a fun detail about the rest of the episode, which I think gets unfairly buried under all this. The midlife crisis material is actually good. Genuinely good. There's a whole sequence where Mr. Krabs tries to work out what young people do and gets it catastrophically wrong, and it lands because everyone has watched an older relative attempt exactly that. The episode understands something true about the specific indignity of trying to prove you're not past it, and it's kind about it as well as funny. That's the frustrating bit. There's a perfectly decent episode about aging sitting inside this thing, and it's inaccessible now because of about 90 seconds elsewhere in it. Which raises a question I don't have a clean answer to, and I suspect nobody does. If a piece of an old thing doesn't work anymore, what's the right move? You can cut the bit. You can put a card in front of it. You can leave it and trust people to place it in its era. Or you can remove the whole thing. Every one of those options has been used by somebody in the last decade on something. There's no consensus. Different companies do different things with comparable material, and mostly they do whichever thing generates the least attention. Removal generates the least attention. That's not a principle, it's just true. I'd also note something about the pairing. This episode aired alongside another one, as most of them do, 2 11-minute stories in a half-hour slot. And when one gets pulled, the other gets pulled with it. because the pair was produced and packaged as a unit. So an entirely unrelated episode goes into the vault as collateral, which is a small, quiet injustice nobody's ever going to campaign about. The other thing I keep coming back to is the timing. 15 years? The episode didn't change during those 15 years. Not a frame of it moved. What changed was the room around it. What a children's network was comfortable putting out. What a review process was looking for. What a parent watching over a kid's shoulder was likely to flag. One thing I'd add, because it comes up whenever this episode is discussed and it's usually stated wrongly, you can still watch it. It's not destroyed. It's not illegal. It has been sold legitimately on digital storefronts, and copies of it exist in an enormous number of homes on physical media because it aired for 15 years and was released on discs during that time. Banned in the modern sense almost never means gone. It means not in the official catalogue. Those are extremely different states of affairs, and the gap between them is why the phrase does so much misleading work online. A thing being unavailable through the front door doesn't make it rare. It makes it slightly inconvenient, which, honestly, is why I find the whole banned media genre a bit overheated. There are real cases of genuinely lost television, early broadcasts that were wiped because tape was expensive, programs where no copy survives anywhere. That's a real loss, and it's worth being upset about. An episode being pulled from a streaming service in 2018 is not that. It's a catalogue decision. The material is fine. It's sitting on a server with a flag on it, as we established, because somebody found it there by accident in 2023. I'd rather people saved their outrage for the tapes that actually went in the bin, and you can see that even more clearly with the next one, because that episode's problem wasn't a joke at all. It was a coincidence. The episode is about a disease called the clam flu, and it was finished before anybody had heard of COVID. That's the whole thing, really. That's the entire story in one sentence, but it's such a specific kind of bad luck that I think it's worth sitting with for a bit. Quarantined Crab is a season 12 episode. The setup is that a health inspector turns up at the Krusty Krab and announces that somebody inside the restaurant has the clam flu, which is highly contagious. Nobody knows who. So the doors go down, everyone gets locked in together, and the episode becomes about a room full of people slowly deciding that everyone else is the infected one, which is, and I want to be clear about this, a completely standard comedy premise. Locked room, hidden threat, everyone turns on each other. It's been done 100 times. If you'd pitched it in 2018, nobody would have blinked. The episode was ready to air in early 2020. Nickelodeon's statement, given to Deadline, was that the episode centres on a virus storyline, and they'd decided not to air it due to sensitivities surrounding the global, real-world pandemic. I don't think anyone could reasonably argue with that. There was a period in 2020 where you genuinely could not put a quarantine comedy on a children's network. Not because the jokes were offensive, but because absolutely nobody had the capacity for it. Everyone was living in it. A cartoon about panicking in a locked restaurant would have gone down like a lead balloon in April 2020. And I say that as someone who thinks broadcasters overcorrect on this sort of thing constantly. Now here's the bit that makes this one worth talking about at length, rather than in passing. It aired anyway, just not in America. France got it on the 6th of May, 2020, which is, and I want you to appreciate the timing here, right in the absolute thick of it. Europe was locked down. France in particular was under one of the stricter regimes on the continent. And a children's channel there looked at an episode about a quarantine and thought, yeah, go on then. Other countries followed, and American audiences didn't see it until the 22nd of April, 2022, nearly 2 years later. I find the difference in judgment genuinely fascinating. Same episode, same content, same pandemic more or less. Two broadcasters looking at the same 22 minutes and reaching completely opposite conclusions about whether their audience could handle it. There's no correct answer there either. It's not like the French broadcast caused a problem. and it's not like Nickelodeon's caution caused one. Both calls were defensible, they just weren't the same call. The other reason I wanted this one right after the last is the contrast, which I think is the most useful thing in this whole video. One episode got pulled in 2018 and never came back. Another episode got pulled in 2020 and came back 2 years later. Same network, same decision-making structure. Completely different outcomes. And the difference between them is dead simple. One was pulled because of what it contains. The other was pulled because of when it landed. Content problems don't expire. Timing problems do. Which is why, when people online talk about banned SpongeBob episodes as though it's a category with lots of members, I get slightly pedantic about it. There's basically one member. Everything else in that pile is either a timing thing that resolved itself, a scene that got trimmed, or an episode that people are angry about for entirely non-official reasons. A quick fun detail, because I think it's the funniest part of the whole affair. The episode was already produced, already dubbed, already scheduled. All the money was spent. It sat in a vault for 2 years, for reasons that had nothing to do with anything anyone involved in making it did. Nobody made a mistake. The world just moved underneath it. That happens more than you'd think in television. There's a whole graveyard of finished episodes across various shows that got shelved because reality decided to do something inconvenient in the same month. I've been meaning to make a proper video about that at some point actually, because some of those stories are wilder than this one. There's a slightly odd afterlife to this one too. By the time it finally aired in America in 2022, the episode had accumulated a reputation it hadn't earned. It had spent 2 years being the banned SpongeBob episode in a lot of online conversation, which meant a chunk of the audience turned up expecting something. Something dark, presumably. Something that justified 2 years in a drawer, and then it's just an episode. It's fine. It's a perfectly reasonable, mid-tier 12th season episode about people being suspicious of each other in a burger restaurant. Nothing in it is remotely shocking. The clam flu is a gag, not a subject. I find that a genuinely funny outcome. The delay created an expectation the episode had no way of meeting, and the only thing that made it notable was the fact that it hadn't been shown. There's a nice symmetry to it as well, which I only spotted while putting this together. 2 episodes were pulled around the same period. One vanished because of something in it that had always been there and had simply stopped being acceptable. The other vanished because of something happening outside it that had nothing to do with the episode at all. Same shelf, opposite causes, and only one of them was ever coming back. Which is a thing worth flagging generally. Actually, a lot of banned material is dull. Forbidden things acquire a glamour that has nothing to do with what's in them. If you've ever finally tracked down a piece of media you spent years hearing was too much for television, you'll know the specific deflation of discovering it's mostly just a bit rubbish. I'd put a decent chunk of the lost media world in that category, honestly. The hunt is more fun than the find. That's not a criticism of the people doing it. The hunting is the point, and I'd argue the preservation genuinely matters regardless of quality, but the finds themselves rarely live up to the years of anticipation. There's a thread here I want to pull on briefly, because it's the part that says something about how the show is actually made. The lead time on animation is long. Very long. From a script being approved to an episode being finished, you're talking well over a year for something at this scale, sometimes closer to 2. Storyboards, voice records, animation, post, dubbing for dozens of territories. Which means every episode of every animated show is, in a small way, a message from the past. It was written by people who had no idea what the world would look like when it arrived. Most of the time, that doesn't matter at all, because most of the time, the world doesn't change much in 18 months. And then occasionally, it changes an enormous amount in about 3 weeks. And a completely innocuous episode about a health inspector becomes something a network can't put on air. Nobody in that production made an error. There's no lesson to draw, it's just the weather. I'd extend that to a fair bit of what people call censorship, actually. A genuine amount of it isn't ideological at all. It's a scheduler looking at a calendar, or a lawyer looking at a risk, or somebody quite junior deciding they'd rather not be the person who signed off on the thing that ends up in a newspaper. Not everything that gets pulled for a reason worth arguing about. Sometimes it gets pulled because it was Tuesday, so everything so far has been a network making a call. From here on, it mostly isn't. The next few controversies didn't involve Nickelodeon deciding anything at all. They involved audiences deciding, which turns out to be a much messier process. There's a moment in the run of this show where a lot of people will tell you it stopped being nice. Not stopped being good necessarily. That's a separate argument, and people fight about it constantly. Nice. There's a stretch roughly around season 6 where the humour shifts from characters being ridiculous to characters being cruel to each other, and a fairly large chunk of the audience never really forgave it. Some context because it matters. Steven Hillenburg stepped back from running the show after the first film. He didn't leave entirely. He stayed involved as an executive producer, but the day-to-day passed to Paul Tibbitt, and the show kept going for a very long time after the point everyone assumed it would end. The film was written as an ending. It has an ending shape. And then the show carried on for another 15-odd years. Whatever you think about the quality curve after that, the tone did change. That part isn't really arguable. The episode everyone reaches for first is The Splinter, from 2008. SpongeBob gets a splinter in his thumb at work. He tries to hide it from Mr. Krabs, because Squidward has convinced him he'll be sent home. Patrick attempts to help, and makes it dramatically worse. And the episode spends a genuinely uncomfortable amount of its runtime on close-up shots of the thumb getting steadily more infected. It sits somewhere around a 4 out of 10 on IMDb, which for this show is properly low, and it's the one that gets cited whenever anyone wants to argue that the gross-out humour got out of hand. I'll say something slightly unpopular here. I don't think The Splinter is the worst thing the show ever did. I think it's the most viscerally unpleasant thing the show ever did, which isn't the same. The writing in it is fine. The Squidward material is actually well constructed. He spends the episode tormenting SpongeBob and then gets a proper comeuppance at the end. The problem is purely that you have to look at the thumb. Gross out humour is a taste thing, and I've never had much of a stomach for it. But there's a real difference between an episode that's badly made and an episode you personally can't watch. And I think a lot of the online conversation about this era smudges those two together. The rest of the cluster gets mentioned in the same breath. Stuck in the Ringer, where SpongeBob gets glued into a household object and the entire town mocks him for it. Face freeze, which is exactly what it sounds like, and involves a lot of distorted faces held on screen for longer than is comfortable. Squid's Visit, where SpongeBob rebuilds his house to look like Squidward's in order to lure him over, which is played as friendship and reads as something considerably less charming. Little Yellow Book, where Squidward reads SpongeBob's diary and shares what's in it, and the whole of Bikini Bottom joins in on the humiliation. The common thread people identify is that the characters stopped being flawed and started being unpleasant. Old Squidward was miserable and got on with it. New Squidward actively went out of his way. Old Patrick was thick. New Patrick was thick in ways that hurt people. Here's the thing I want to be really clear about, because it separates this lot from the last two entirely. None of these episodes were pulled, not one. There was no standards review, no network statement, no removal. They all still air. They're all on streaming right now. You can watch every single one of them tonight if you want, though I'd gently suggest you don't want. This is a fan controversy, start to finish. It exists in forum threads, IMDb ratings, YouTube retrospectives, and the sort of ranked lists people have been making for 15 years. It's real, the reaction is genuine, and it's large, but it's a completely different category of thing from an episode a network decided it couldn't broadcast. which is that same pedantry from earlier, I'm afraid. Widely hated is not the same claim as banned, and people use the second word for the first thing constantly. A last thought on this era, because I've been chewing on it while writing this. A lot of the anger about this era is really about growing up. The people who were most annoyed about season 6 were mostly people who'd loved the first 3 seasons as small children and were now teenagers watching a show that hadn't grown with them. That's not nothing, the show genuinely did change, but some of it is the entirely ordinary experience of a thing you loved at 7 not being as good when you're 14. Sort of like how your parents' favourite restaurant was never as good as they insisted it was, and also they were right that it used to be better. Both things can be true. The show did get meaner, and a chunk of the audience was also just leaving it behind. There's a technical explanation for part of the shift as well, and I don't think it gets enough airtime because it's less satisfying than the writers got worse. The show moved to digital production around this era. Earlier seasons were made with a slightly rougher, more hand-worked look. You can see the difference immediately if you flick between a season 2 episode and a season 7-1. Lines are cleaner now, colours are flatter, everything is a bit more precise, and precision is the enemy of this particular kind of gross-out joke. A thumb drawn slightly loosely, with visible texture and a bit of wobble, reads as cartoonish. The same thumb rendered cleanly, with smooth gradients and sharp edges, reads as a thumb. The joke didn't change. The rendering did, and the rendering was doing more work than anyone realised. That's my honest theory about why the later gross-out material lands so differently, and it's not something you can pin on a writer. The other thing that changed is the sheer volume. There is an enormous amount of this show, hundreds of episodes across more than 2 decades, produced on a schedule by a rotating crew under commercial pressure to keep going. Nothing made at that scale stays at the level of its first 3 years. Nothing. The early seasons of any long-running show are made by a small group of people with time and nothing to lose, and the later seasons are made by a large group of people with a deadline. You can be annoyed about that, or you can accept it, but I don't think you can really be surprised by it. Another episode from this cluster deserves a mention because it's the one I actually think is worst, and it's not the one people usually name. Little Yellow Book has Squidward reading SpongeBob's diary, which is a mean but workable premise. Squidward doing something petty is the entire character. Where it goes wrong is the second half, when the whole town joins in on the mockery. That's the bit that breaks it. Bikini Bottom is normally indifferent to SpongeBob at worst. Turning the entire population into a jeering crowd changes the world of the show, not just one character's behaviour, and worlds are harder to repair than characters. The episode is also weirdly bleak about it. SpongeBob forgives Squidward at the end, which is meant to land as sweet, and instead lands as a bit sad, because it makes him look like someone who has no other option. That's the thing about this era in general, I think. The problem was rarely that any individual episode went too far. It's that a run of them, taken together, made the world of the show colder. And once a world has gone cold, it takes an awful lot of good episodes to warm it back up, which the show did eventually manage. For what it's worth. The later seasons are much kinder than the ones we've been talking about. There's an angle on this era that I find genuinely interesting, and it concerns how the internet changed what a bad episode even means. Before roughly 2007, if you watched an episode of a cartoon and thought it was rubbish, that was the end of it. You told a friend at school. You didn't watch it again. The episode went into the rerun pile and got absorbed into the general mass of the show. After 2007, you could write about it, and other people could agree with you, and somebody could make a video about it, and then somebody else could make a video responding to that video, and within a few years, an individual 11-minute segment could have more written about it than most feature films. That's what happened to this stretch of the show. It's the first era of SpongeBob that had a fully formed online audience watching it in real time and reacting immediately. The earlier seasons got reappraised retrospectively, warmly, by people remembering them. These ones got processed live, by teenagers, at the exact moment they were least inclined to be generous about anything. I don't think that's nothing. The reputation of this era was set by a very particular audience in a very particular mood, and it hardened before anyone had a chance to reconsider. There's also the small matter of the rankings themselves, which get quoted as though they're objective. Aggregate ratings on any given episode of this show are heavily shaped by who bothers to go and vote, and the people who bother are disproportionately the people who felt strongly. Nobody logs in to give a perfectly fine episode a 7. They log in to give a hated one a 1, which means the low scores are real as a signal of intensity and much less meaningful as a measure of quality, worth holding lightly. One episode from this general period gets named more than any other though, and it's the one that produced an actual petition. This is the episode that got a petition written about it. Not a petition in the loose internet sense where someone tweets that something should be cancelled. An actual Change.org petition addressed to Viacom, asking them to stop airing a specific episode of a children's cartoon. And it wasn't organised by a parents group or a media watchdog. It was written by fans of the show. That's what makes this one different from everything up to now. Nobody official complained about this episode. The people who complained about it were the people who loved it. One Course Meal is from Season 7, 2010. The premise is that Mr. Krabs discovers Plankton is terrified of whales and decides to use that against him. Not once as a prank, continuously for over 2 weeks, until Plankton won't leave the chum bucket. By the end of it, Plankton is in a genuinely bad state, and the episode has a scene where he's at his lowest point and stops caring what happens to him. I'm not going to walk through that scene, and I'd rather not linger on it, because the specifics aren't really the interesting part and there's no version of describing it that's useful to anyone. What's interesting is the reaction. Fans objected on a few grounds, and they're worth laying out properly, because they're more considered than "this made me uncomfortable." The first was proportion. Plankton is a recurring antagonist, and his entire scheme across the whole series is attempting to steal a burger recipe. That's it. That's the crime. He has never in the show's history done anything that would justify 16 days of psychological torment, and the episode doesn't try to argue otherwise. The second was consequences. Mr. Krabs doesn't get any. He isn't told off. He doesn't reflect. He doesn't lose anything. There's a stretch where Plankton attempts to turn it around on him, and even that resolves with Mr. Krabs coming out on top. The episode's structure treats him as the winner. The third, and this is the one that generated most of the heat, was tone. The show frames the whole thing as comedy. It's shot like a comedy, scored like a comedy, paced like a comedy, and a large number of viewers came away feeling that the writers hadn't clocked what they'd actually put on screen, or worse, had clocked it and thought it was fine. The petition's argument was essentially that last point, that the episode read as though nobody involved had taken the subject seriously. The numbers back up how badly it landed with the audience. It sits around 3.7 on IMDb, which puts it as roughly the second lowest rated episode of the entire series. WatchMojo ranked it the single worst SpongeBob episode in April of 2024, which is a good decade and a half after it aired. This is not a reaction that faded. Now, in the interest of being fair, there is a defence, and I've seen it made well. Some viewers point out that this is one of the more developed roles Plankton ever got. Most of his episodes are functionally identical. He schemes, he fails, the credits roll. Here he's an actual character with an actual history, including the detail about his ancestors and whales, which is where the fear comes from in the first place. There's a real argument that the episode is doing more with him than the show usually bothers to. They'd also note that the show does let him move past it. he recovers. He's fine in the next episode, and every episode after, because this is a cartoon, and that's how cartoons work. I don't think that defense wins, personally, but it isn't nothing, and I'd rather present it than pretend the reaction was universal. The bit that matters most is the same point I made a moment ago. Nickelodeon never pulled this episode. It aired. It kept airing. It's on streaming. The most complained about episode in the show's history, the one with a petition attached to it, the one that regularly gets voted worst, has never faced any official action at all. Whereas Midlife Crustacean, an episode with a 50-year-old prank reference in it, which nobody was writing petitions about, is the one that's gone. I'm not saying that's wrong exactly. I'm saying it's a good illustration of how these decisions actually get made, which is not by counting complaints. A standards review is looking for specific categories of content against a specific rubric. Audience fury is a different input entirely. And it turns out it's a much weaker one. There's a companion piece to this episode that gets brought up in the same breath, and I'll mention it briefly rather than doing the whole thing, because the complaint is broadly identical. A Pal for Gary is the one where SpongeBob brings home a second pet who terrorizes Gary, and then blames Gary for it at the end. It sits around 3.3 on IMDb, which makes it the lowest rated episode of the show. Same objection, a character behaving badly, no consequences, the episode siding with the wrong party. 2 episodes, both from roughly the same era, both at the bottom of every ranking anyone's ever made, both still perfectly available. I want to spend a moment on why fans reacted so strongly to this one specifically, because plenty of cartoons have done darker things and not generated this kind of response. I think it comes down to what this show had established about itself. SpongeBob is, at its base, a fundamentally kind program. That's the thing underneath all the noise. The main character is delighted to be alive. His best friend is thick and lovely. His neighbour hates them both and is never actually rid of them. And the emotional temperature is warm, even when the jokes are strange. That's the deal the show made with its audience in 1999. Mr. Krabs in particular has a very specific role in that arrangement. He's greedy. That's his one thing. His greed is a character flaw played for laughs, and the show has always been clear that it's a flaw. He gets punished for it constantly, usually by losing money in some ironic fashion. What this episode does is take that established greed and swap it for something else entirely, which is enjoyment of another character's distress. Those aren't the same trait. Greed is funny because it's about money, and money is stupid. Enjoying someone's suffering isn't funny at all, and it isn't what the character was. So the objection isn't really, this was too dark for a kids' show. Plenty of things in this show are dark. The objection is that it broke the terms of the arrangement, and it did it with a character the audience had spent 11 years learning how to read. There's a related point about the show's usual approach to dark material, which I think is right. When SpongeBob does something bleak, it's normally quick and it's normally implied. It'll gesture at something grim and move on before you've fully processed it, and that speed is what keeps it in comedy territory. The complaint about this episode is that it stops, it stays, it gives you time to think about what you're looking at, and once you've had time to think about it, the comedy has nowhere to go. That's a craft argument, and I find it more persuasive than the moral one. For balance, I'd note the show has done quick, dark, implied things constantly, and nobody minds. Characters get eaten, characters get destroyed and reassembled. There's an entire episode built around a health inspector who everyone believes has been killed, and it's regarded as one of the good ones. Darkness has never been the issue. Duration has. There's a strange footnote to all this that I think is worth mentioning, which is what the fandom then did with it. The episode generated a creepypasta. If you're not familiar with that world, creepypasta is essentially internet folklore, horror stories written to look like leaked footage or lost episodes, passed around as though they might be real. Someone wrote one built on this episode, imagining a version where things went differently. I mention it not because the story's any good, it isn't, but because it tells you something about how much this episode got under people's skin. Fans didn't just complain about it, they wrote fiction about it. They kept it alive for over a decade in a way that a merely bad episode never generates. Anger is a form of engagement, unfortunately. The episodes nobody talks about are the ones that were simply forgettable, and there are far more of those than there are of these. One last observation on this one, and then we'll move somewhere lighter. Something worth remembering about all the episodes in this general category is that they were made under time pressure by people producing an enormous quantity of material, and that the process has more moving parts than the finished thing suggests. A premise gets pitched, it gets boarded, it gets revised, voices get recorded, animation gets done overseas, and by the time anyone watches the whole thing assembled, a very large amount of money has already been spent. Which means that if a tonal problem is going to be caught, it needs to be caught early, at the stage where it's still a drawing and a sentence. And tonal problems are the hardest kind to spot at that stage, because a storyboard doesn't have timing, it doesn't have music, it doesn't have the specific weight that a held shot acquires once it's actually held. So an episode can look fine on paper and land completely differently on screen, and nobody involved has done anything obviously wrong at any individual step. I'd bet reasonable money that's what happened here. Not malice, not indifference, a sequence that read as a gag in the board and read as something else entirely once it had been animated, scored and paced, by which point changing it would have meant scrapping a large chunk of finished work. That's a guess, mind. Nobody's ever said so publicly, and I could be completely wrong about it. But it fits how animation is made better than the theory that a room full of comedy writers deliberately set out to make children unhappy. Alright, that's the heaviest bit of this video done. From here on, it gets a lot stranger, because the next few controversies barely involve the show at all. In November of 2013, a 22-minute episode of a children's program became a talking point on American political television, and I still don't think anybody involved really understood how it happened. The episode is called SpongeBob You're Fired, and I want to describe the plot first because the plot is important to how silly this gets. Mr. Krabs works out that he can save a nickel by getting rid of his fry cook, so he fires SpongeBob. SpongeBob doesn't cope with it well. Patrick attempts to cheer him up by explaining the joys of not having a job, which he calls fun employment. SpongeBob eventually goes looking for work elsewhere, gets hired at 4 different restaurants, and gets fired from all 4 for inventing new varieties of Krabby Patty. Meanwhile, the Krusty Krab falls apart without him. At the end, Mr. Krabs rehires him, and everything returns to exactly how it was. That's it. It is a completely standard status quo episode, of the sort this show has done dozens of times. Nothing changes, nothing was ever going to change. There's one line in it that caused all the trouble. When Patrick is demonstrating the fun employment lifestyle, SpongeBob says something to the effect that unemployment may be fun for Patrick, but he needs to get a job. That's the line. That's what all of this was about. Before the episode had even aired on television, the New York Post ran a piece on it, and Fox News picked it up, and both used the episode as material in an ongoing argument about social services and food assistance programs. The angle was roughly, even SpongeBob understands you should want to work. Media Matters for America pushed back on that, and Al Sharpton took it up on MSNBC, arguing that those outlets were taking a children's cartoon and pressing it into service for a political point about poor people. So you had, for a stretch of days, actual political commentators on actual news networks arguing with each other about the ideological content of a sponge. I want to be careful here, because I'm not going to tell you which side of the underlying argument to be on. That's a real debate with real stakes, and it has nothing to do with this video. What I'm interested in is the mechanism, which is that a piece of children's entertainment got picked up as ammunition by people who, quite clearly, hadn't given the episode itself much thought. Because if you actually watch it, the episode isn't making an argument about anything. The show's own account of the line was that it was about SpongeBob's character. He's relentlessly enthusiastic about his job. That's been true since 1999. He is genuinely the only person in the entire show who enjoys working at the Krusty Krab. And the joke of the line is that he can't be talked out of it, even when he's being handed a perfectly good excuse. You could also, if you were determined, read the episode the exact opposite way from how it was used. The villain of the piece is a business owner who fires a loyal employee to save 5 pence. The 4 restaurant managers who hire SpongeBob all fire him for being too good at his job. At the very end, Mr. Krabs recoups his nickel by installing a pay toilet in the restaurant. If you wanted to argue that this episode has a message about employers, you'd have considerably more to work with than the other reading. Nobody made that argument on television, as far as I can tell, which tells you something about how selective the whole exercise was. There's a detail I love about the timing. The episode had its first public screening at San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2013, as part of an event Tom Kenny hosted. So a room full of fans watched it months before any of this kicked off, and there is no record of a single one of them coming out and saying, "Hang on, what's this saying about the welfare state?" It took a newspaper to find that. The fan reaction, incidentally, was completely separate and much less interesting. People didn't like the episode much, but not for political reasons. The complaints were about it being padded and predictable, which for a special that runs longer than a normal instalment is a fair enough thing to say. It sits low in the rankings alongside the ones we talked about earlier. It's just not very good. That's a much more ordinary problem than the one the news was having. What sticks with me about this one is how completely everyone talked past the actual object. There were people on national television describing an episode's politics who I would bet money had watched about 90 seconds of it. The show wasn't participating in the argument. The show was just sitting there. There's a wider thing going on here that I think is worth naming because this show has an unusual relationship with it. Children's cartoons are one of the very few cultural objects that almost everyone in a country has in common. Adults don't share much anymore. The television landscape fragmented decades ago, and nobody watches the same thing. But nearly everyone under about 45 has seen this show. That makes it an incredibly efficient reference point because you never have to explain it, which makes it enormously attractive to anyone trying to make a point quickly. You don't need a paragraph of setup. You say the name, and the entire audience is already there with you. So the show keeps getting drafted into arguments it has no stake in, purely because it's the most legible object in the room. That's not a conspiracy, and it's not really anyone behaving badly. It's just what happens to things that everybody knows. And this show is particularly vulnerable to it, I think, because it's genuinely ambiguous in places. The character is an adult with a job he loves and no ambition to advance. Depending on what you already believe, that's either a portrait of contentment or a portrait of exploitation, and the show has never come down on either side because it isn't interested in the question. It's interested in whether a jellyfish sting is funny. So people fill in the gap themselves and then argue about what they've filled in. You saw a small version of this even in the fan response to the episode, actually. There's a whole strand of online discussion about whether the ending is depressing. SpongeBob goes back to the exact job that fired him over 5 pence. And the show treats that as a happy resolution. Some people read that as sweet. Some people read it as bleak. Both readings are available in the text and the show doesn't adjudicate. The other detail I keep returning to is how completely disposable the whole thing was. It ran for a few days. Cable news moved on to something else. Nobody's career changed. Nobody's mind changed, and the episode kept airing exactly as it always had, which is the least dramatic possible ending to a controversy and, I suspect, the honest one for most of them. Very few of these stories end with a consequence. They end with everybody getting bored. The only lasting effect, as far as I can tell, is that this episode now has a permanent asterisk next to it in every ranking anyone makes, and people who weren't alive for any of it repeat, "That's the political one," without knowing what the politics were. There's a small piece of trivia about the special that I enjoy far more than any of the politics. The very last gag of the episode is Mr. Krabs installing a pay toilet in the restaurant, charging a nickel to use it, and thereby recovering the exact amount he lost by rehiring his fry cook. The episode structure is a closed loop. He ends up precisely where he started, financially, and the only thing that happened in between is that 4 other restaurants nearly went out of business and one sponge had a breakdown. That's a properly cynical joke about business, hidden in the last 15 seconds of an episode that spent a week being described on cable news as a lecture about the work ethic. Nobody mentioned it. Not one commentator on either side brought up the punchline the writers actually chose to end on. I'd be more annoyed about that if I thought anyone involved had got as far as the ending. And that turns out to be a recurring pattern with this programme, because it happened in a much bigger way 8 years earlier, and that time it involved Congress. Almost everybody remembers this story wrong, including me before I looked into it properly. And the wrongness is the interesting part. The version that stuck is, in 2005, a conservative Christian leader announced that SpongeBob was gay and got laughed at by the entire country for it. He didn't say that. He said something else. The something else got compressed into a headline, and the headline was so much better than the actual claim that it simply replaced it in the public record, which is a thing that happens constantly and is worth watching happen in slow motion. Here's what was going on. The We Are Family Foundation, set up by the music producer Nile Rodgers, the man behind the song of the same name, which if you don't know it, you know it, put together a video for American schools. It was built around the song, and it featured an enormous number of children's television characters singing along together. SpongeBob was one of them. So were characters from a dozen other shows. The theme was tolerance and getting on with people who aren't like you. 61,000 copies were going out to elementary schools. FedEx shipped them for free. The Southern Poverty Law Center had written an accompanying tolerance pledge as part of a broader campaign, and that pledge included respect for differences in culture, belief, and sexual identity. That last phrase is where the whole thing started. The first objection came from the American Family Association, in a piece by the editor of their monthly journal, Ed Vitaliano. His argument was that the project looked like a reasonable effort to teach kids about cultural difference on the surface, and that a short step underneath that surface, one of the differences being celebrated was homosexuality. Then James Dobson, founder of Focus on the Family, and at that point one of the more influential Christian figures in America, mentioned the video while speaking at a black-tie dinner in Washington in January 2005, held around the presidential inauguration. He referred to SpongeBob appearing in what he described as a pro-homosexual video, and that was it. That was the sentence. Within days, the New York Times had it, the Wall Street Journal had it, and every newspaper in the country had run some version of Focus on the Family, founder says SpongeBob is gay. Dobson went on MSNBC's Scarborough Country on the 31st of January to sort it out, and he was pretty exasperated about it. He said he'd never said the character was gay, that he'd been misquoted and maligned, and that virtually every newspaper in the country had reported something he hadn't said. His actual complaint, as he laid it out, was with the foundation rather than the video. He pointed to links on their website to a set of large gay rights organisations and to material in an online teacher's guide. He said explicitly that he didn't have a problem with the video itself. Now you can think that objection is reasonable, or you can think it's paranoid. That's genuinely up to you, and I'm not going to push you either way, because it's a live political argument that people still have, and it isn't mine to settle. What I'd say is that man objects to a foundation's website links and man says cartoon sponge is gay are extremely different stories, and the media picked the second one because it was funnier. The foundation, for what it's worth, took the relevant material off their site during the row, which Dobson then cited as evidence he'd been onto something. Nobody involved in making SpongeBob had any part in any of this. The character was in a charity video. That was the extent of it. Right, since we're on this general subject, there are two more of these, and they're both from other countries. In August of 2012, a fringe Catholic group in Ukraine produced a report arguing that a set of Western children's programs were, and I promise this is the actual phrasing, a large-scale experiment on Ukrainian children intended to create criminals and perverts. SpongeBob was on the list. So were Teletubbies, Shrek, The Simpsons, Pokemon, and South Park, which is a bafflingly broad category of thing. The reasoning for including SpongeBob was the character's friendship with Patrick. The reasoning for including Teletubbies was that the program allegedly produces people who sit in front of a screen with their mouths open, absorbing whatever they're given, which is a criticism I find genuinely quite funny because it's about 80% right about television in general. Ukraine's National Expert Commission for Protecting Public Morality, a real state body tasked with checking media against the country's morality laws, announced it would convene to consider the report. The Wall Street Journal covered it, Time covered it, and for about a week there were headlines everywhere about Ukraine banning SpongeBob. Ukraine did not ban SpongeBob. Nothing came of it at all. The commission itself was abolished by the Ukrainian parliament on the 10th of February 2015, and that was the end of that particular institution. The last one is much more recent and much smaller, and I'll flag up front that I've seen it reported from one place rather than several, so treat it accordingly. There's a scene in an episode called Artist Unknown where SpongeBob paints a rainbow over his head with his hands. If you've been on the internet at any point in the last decade, you've seen it. It's one of the most reused reaction images in existence, and it's been captioned with every joke a person can think of. Reports in 2026 indicated that in a Russian dub, the rainbow was recoloured. Not a rainbow, just a plain yellow arc. The context being Russia's laws around what they classify as propaganda concerning non-traditional relationships, which have been expanding since 2013. And the thing about that scene is that it has nothing whatsoever to do with any of it. It's a sponge making a shape with his hands to indicate that something is nice. That's the joke. That's the entire joke, which is, I think, a decent summary of this whole business. In none of these stories was anybody actually arguing about SpongeBob. He was a convenient object that a much older argument got draped over. There is one thing worth adding though, and it's about the show itself rather than the people shouting about it. The reason the character keeps ending up in this particular argument isn't random. It's because of how he's written, and how he's written is quite deliberate. Steven Hillenburg addressed the question directly during his lifetime, more than once, and his position was consistent and fairly dry about it. Sponges reproduce asexually. The character isn't straight and isn't gay because the character isn't anything. He's a sponge, and the question doesn't apply to him in the way people are asking it. He described the character as somewhat asexual, which for a marine biologist writing about an actual marine organism is less of a dodge than it might sound. But the show also does something that plenty of children's programs don't, which is that it lets its male characters be openly and unembarrassedly affectionate with each other. SpongeBob and Patrick hold hands. They cry. They live in each other's pockets. They have an emotional register that a lot of American television, and particularly a lot of American television aimed at boys, spent decades treating as off-limits. That's a real thing about the show. It's one of the nicest things about it, actually. An entire generation grew up with a lead character who was allowed to be soft without it being the punchline. And that is why he keeps turning up in these arguments. Not because of any coded message, and not because anyone hid anything in the show, because the character is unguarded in a way that some people find genuinely lovely, and some people find suspicious, and both groups are responding to exactly the same thing. I know which reading I prefer, I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I'd note that neither reading is coming from anything the writers put in as a message, because there's no evidence they put one in at all. They wrote a very silly character who likes his friend a lot. The last thing I'd say about all of it is how strange the geography is. A dinner speech in Washington, a report by a fringe group in Kiev, a dubbing decision in Moscow. 21 years apart, 3 completely different political situations. No connection between any of them except the object at the centre. If you told anyone in 1999 that the sponge would end up in that particular file, I don't think they'd have believed you. Although, and this is the bit that makes me laugh, the 2005 story came at a point when the character was already having a strange year in the news. There'd been a run of thefts from Burger King locations of the large promotional figures they'd put outside their restaurants. People were taking them. It became a minor recurring news item. So there was a stretch of that January where a national news outlet had to cover 2 entirely unrelated SpongeBob stories in the same week. One about theological objections to a charity video, and one about people nicking a plastic sponge off a forecourt. I'd like to have been in that editorial meeting. Right, enough politics. Let's talk about the man who made it, because his part of this is the only bit that isn't really an argument at all. The 26th of November, 2018, Steven Hillenburg died of ALS. He was 57. He'd announced the diagnosis the year before and had kept working on the show for as long as he could manage it. I'm not going to do a big emotional set piece about this, partly because it's not that kind of video, and partly because I don't think he'd have wanted one. But it's the hinge that everything here swings on, and it's worth stating plainly rather than skirting around. The first thing that happened afterwards was the Super Bowl. There's an episode called Band Geeks from season 2, which a very large number of people will tell you is the best thing the show ever did. Squidward assembles a hopeless marching band out of the residents of Bikini Bottom, spends the whole episode being humiliated by how bad they are, and then at the actual performance they play a song called Sweet Victory. And it's genuinely, unironically triumphant. It's 11 minutes of build-up paying off perfectly. The episode is set at a sporting event, so when Hillenburg died a couple of months before Super Bowl III, fans organised. There was a petition asking for Sweet Victory to be performed at the halftime show as a tribute. It got enormous traction, the sort of numbers that make it into news coverage on its own. What happened on the night was that a short clip appeared, referencing the episode, and then the show moved on to something else entirely. The song wasn't performed, the reaction was fairly ferocious. People felt they'd been teased rather than given anything, which is a reasonable read of what happened. David Glenn Isley, who sang the original track, was publicly unhappy about it. I've got mixed feelings on that one. Halftime shows are booked months in advance by people with contracts, and the idea that a petition could rearrange one was probably never realistic. But the clip was the worst of both options. Enough of a nod to confirm they'd heard. Not enough to actually be the thing. Or either do it or don't. The bigger story came about 6 months after he died, and it's still the thing fans of this show argue about most. Nickelodeon announced Camp Coral, a computer-animated prequel series about a 10-year-old SpongeBob at a summer camp. The response was immediate, and it was loud, and the argument had 2 parts. The first was timing. 6 months. In 19 years of the show running, there had never been a spin-off. And then within half a year of his death, there was one, plus reports of more in development. To a lot of people that read as a company that had been waiting, The second was the specific shape of it. There's a well-known piece of the show's origin story where, when Hillenburg was pitching it in the 1990s, executives wanted the character to be a child who goes to school. He said no. That's not the show. The whole idea of SpongeBob was an adult who has an adult job and a mortgage on a pineapple, and is nevertheless having the time of his life, the joke being that you don't have to stop enjoying things just because you've grown up. So he compromised on boating school and kept the character an adult. Camp Coral is a 10-year-old SpongeBob at summer camp, which is, more or less exactly, the thing he'd refused to make. Petitions went up on change.org, several of them in different countries, gathering thousands of signatures between them. The core demand was that Nickelodeon respect the creator's wishes and cancel it. And then Paul Tibbitt weighed in, which is what made it a real story rather than a fan story. Tibbitt is the person Hillenburg personally chose to take over as showrunner. He ran the show for about a decade. He knew the man professionally, as well as almost anyone. And he posted that while he meant no disrespect to the colleagues working on the new series, who he called good people and talented artists, this was greedy, lazy executiving, and they all knew full well Steve would have hated it. He finished with shame on them. That's a strong thing to say publicly about your former employer, and it's the single most quoted line in the entire dispute. Now there's a piece of this that almost never gets included, and I think it should. Vincent Waller, who we've mentioned already and who has been showrunner on the main series for years, pushed back on the premise directly. His point was about what Hillenburg actually said. The quote everyone bases the argument on is Hillenburg saying, "I don't see any spin-offs," and Waller's argument is that "I don't see any spin-offs" is not the same sentence as "I would never do a spin-off." One is an observation about the present, the other is a commitment about the future. He backed it with a fair bit of evidence too. Hillenburg said he had no interest in making a film. He then made one and took part in 3. Waller also said that Hillenburg was aware Camp Coral was in development. Not that he approved it, not that he oversaw it, but that he knew about it and didn't live to see it finished. Waller's own view was that he thinks it would have made him happy. So you've got 2 people, both of whom worked closely with him for years, both of whom have every reason to be honest, remembering his position completely differently. I don't think that's resolvable, and I don't think it should be. People contain contradictions. It's entirely possible he said both things at different points, to different people, in different moods, and meant them both at the time. Anyone who's ever been asked about their own future plans twice in 1 year knows how that goes. Camp Coral came out on Paramount Plus in March of 2021. The Patrick Star Show followed. More has come since. The franchise is now considerably larger than the show, and nobody's under any illusions about that being reversed. What I'd say, gently, is that this argument was never really about a prequel series. It was about grief, and about a very large number of people who loved something feeling like they were the last line of defence for someone who couldn't speak for himself anymore. And that's a decent instinct, even when the facts turn out to be muddier than the argument needs them to be. There's a thing about Hillenburg's career that I think explains why people were so protective, and it's not just that he made a popular cartoon. He walked away from it. That's the bit. After the first film, which was written as an ending, and which he intended to be an ending, he stepped back at what was unambiguously the peak. The show was the biggest thing on the network. He could have run it for another 20 years and been extremely comfortable. Instead, he handed it over, went off and worked on other things, made a live-action film almost nobody saw, and generally behaved like someone who wasn't especially interested in the size of the thing he'd built. That's rare. It's rare in any industry, and it's very rare in that one. And it bought him an enormous amount of goodwill from an audience who could tell, without being told, that he wasn't in it for the merchandising. So when spin-offs arrived 6 months after his funeral, the reaction wasn't really about whether Camp Coral was any good. It was about the contrast. The person who'd left money on the table was gone, and the people who hadn't were still there. Whether that's fair to the actual crew working on those shows is a different question, and Tibbett was careful about that in his own statement. He went out of his way to say the artists involved were good people doing good work. That distinction matters, and it got lost almost immediately, as it always does. And I'd imagine it was quite unpleasant to be an animator on that production reading the reaction. There's a piece of context I'd add to the whole spin-off argument, and it's the least romantic one. Nickelodeon needed programming. Paramount Plus was launching, and streaming services launch on the back of recognisable properties. That's the actual mechanism here, and it had nothing to do with anybody's death. A service was being built, and the biggest asset in the building got put to work. The timing looks appalling, and probably was appalling. The decision itself was made for reasons that were being made at every studio simultaneously. That doesn't make it feel any better. I don't think it's supposed to. What I'd say, finally, about the sweet victory business is that it's a very good example of how grief attaches itself to specific objects. Nobody was really asking for a song. What people were asking for was an acknowledgement at the largest possible scale that someone who'd mattered to them had died. The song was just the available vehicle. It happened to fit a sporting event, a triumphant performance, an episode about a group of hopeless people pulling something off together against expectations. You couldn't design a better tribute if you tried. And when it didn't happen, the disappointment wasn't proportionate to a song not being played. It was proportionate to the thing underneath it. There's a final detail about the transition that I think is worth putting on the record because it complicates the cash grab framing a bit. The main show didn't stop. It's still going. It's been going the whole time, made largely by people who were there when Hillenburg was, including Waller, and by all accounts, it's been in reasonable health for years. The later seasons are widely considered to have recovered a lot of what the middle ones lost. The meanness dialed back, the character writing steadier, the willingness to be strange for its own sake back in place. That doesn't get discussed nearly as much as the spin-offs do, because long-running show is quietly fine now isn't a story. Nobody makes a video about that. But it's true, and I think it matters when weighing up how the franchise has been handled. It would have been very easy to let the original wither, while the new properties took the attention. That's not really what happened. There's also something slightly moving about the fact that a substantial number of the people making it now are people who have been making it for 20 years. That's a career. That's a working life spent on a show about a sponge, and by every account I've read, it's a happy place to work, which is not something you can say about most productions that run that long. Hillenburg built that. That's arguably the more durable legacy than any individual episode. That's most of it, if I'm honest. The petitions, the arguments about what he would have wanted, the fury at a prequel about a summer camp. None of it is really about any of that. 2 more to go, and they're both quieter. One's a psychology paper. One's an anthropology paper. Neither of them involved anybody being angry at the show, which after all that is quite a relief. Every 11 seconds. That's the number the whole thing turns on. In the show, on average, the scene changes about every 11 seconds. In the comparison program they used, it was closer to every 34. That gap is the study. In September of 2011, the journal Pediatrics published a piece of research led by Angeline Lillard and Jennifer Peterson, both in the psychology department at the University of Virginia. The question they were asking was pretty narrow and pretty sensible. Everyone already knew that long-term television exposure was associated with attention problems in children, but far less was known about what happens immediately afterwards. Right after, minutes after. So they set up something quite simple. 64-year-olds randomly split into 3 groups. One group watched 9 minutes of a fast-paced cartoon about an animated sponge who lives under the sea. In the paper they describe it that way, rather than naming it, which is standard academic caution and also very funny because everybody knew. One group watched 9 minutes of a slower-paced educational program about an ordinary preschool-aged boy, which was Caillou, and one group just drew for 9 minutes with markers and crayons. Then all 60 children were given 4 tasks measuring what psychologists call executive function. That's the umbrella term for the stuff that lets you get anything done: holding attention, working memory, solving a problem, waiting for something instead of grabbing it immediately. It's one of the better predictors of how a child gets on at school. The children who'd watched the fast cartoon did significantly worse than the other 2 groups, and that finding went absolutely everywhere. It was on the news in America within hours, then everywhere else. The headlines were almost uniformly some variation of "SpongeBob makes your children stupid," which is not what the study said. It's not even close. I want to go through the caveats properly, partly because they're interesting and partly because this is a very good example of a real finding getting mangled on the way to the public. First, the sample was 60 children. That's small. Not uselessly small, but small enough that you'd want it replicated before you built anything on it. Second, the effect was measured immediately after viewing. The researchers were explicit that they didn't know how long it lasted. Nobody demonstrated that these children were worse at anything an hour later, let alone permanently. The whole point of the study was the immediate window. Third, and this is the big one, Lillard herself said the show shouldn't be singled out. She'd found similar results with other fast-paced programming. The variable being tested was pace, not the sponge. Any cartoon cutting at that rate would likely have produced the same result. The show was chosen because it was popular and fast, not because there was anything specifically wrong with it. Nickelodeon's response noted that the sample consisted of white children from middle to upper-class families, which is a fair methodological point and also, very obviously, a company defending its biggest asset. Both things at once. What Lillard's actual advice amounted to was quite practical and quite modest. She said parents should be aware that young children are compromised in their ability to learn and use self-control immediately after watching that kind of show, and that she wouldn't recommend it on the way to school, or at any point where a child is about to be expected to concentrate. That's it. That's the takeaway. Don't put on a frantic cartoon 20 minutes before you need a 4-year-old to sit still and pay attention, which honestly, most parents worked out on their own about 50 years ago. There was an editorial published alongside the study by Dimitri Christakis, who works on children and media at Seattle Children's Research Institute, and I think his framing was the most useful thing to come out of the whole episode. His line was that if the findings hold up, it means content matters as much as quantity. It's not just about turning the television off, it's about changing the channel. That's a genuinely useful idea, and it's the one bit of this that almost nobody reported because it doesn't fit in a headline. The thing I find slightly maddening about this story is that the real finding is more interesting than the fake one. Cartoon rots brain is a claim people have been making since television was invented, and it's boring. The editing rhythm of what a child watches has a measurable, short-term effect on their ability to concentrate, is a genuinely intriguing idea that suggests all sorts of follow-up questions. And the second version got almost no coverage at all because the first version had a sponge in it. There's a small irony sitting underneath all this that I quite enjoy. The show's pace is not an accident or a symptom of decline. It's a deliberate comedy choice. That density of gags per minute is exactly why the show works, why it's so quotable, and why an entire generation can recite chunks of it from memory. The thing the study identified as a problem is the same thing that made it good. You could say something similar about a lot of things. The stuff that makes something brilliant is usually the same stuff that makes it a bit much. There's a bit of history behind why this study got the coverage it did, and it's not really about the study. Arguments about children and screens are extremely old and extremely cyclical. Comic books in the 1950s, television generally in the 1960s and 70s. video games from the 1980s onwards. Every new medium gets a decade of research, panic, headlines, and eventual shrugging, and the pattern repeats almost exactly each time with the noun swapped out. By 2011, television was well past its panic phase. The interesting argument had moved to the internet and to phones. So a study about television arriving in that year needed a hook to get any attention at all, and it had a spectacular one. The most recognisable children's character on the planet. Which meant the finding travelled on the strength of its example rather than its content. The example was never the point. The example was interchangeable. And it became the entire story. I'd note as well that the study has a slightly odd afterlife in the way these things often do. It gets cited constantly in parenting articles, usually without any of the caveats, and usually in a form that implies something permanent. Studies have shown is doing an awful lot of unearned work in most of those pieces. That's not the researchers' fault. They published a careful, narrow, appropriately hedged piece of work, and then it left the building and went feral. There's a nice detail in the paper's own phrasing that I keep thinking about. They never name the show. They describe it as a very popular, fantastical cartoon about an animated sponge that lives under the sea, which is such an obvious non-identification that it's almost a joke. That's standard practice. You describe the stimulus rather than naming the brand, partly for methodological reasons, and partly because naming brands in academic work invites problems. And it made absolutely no difference. Every single outlet identified it instantly, because there is exactly one animated sponge that lives under the sea, and there has been for a quarter of a century. The last thing worth saying is about what the study didn't test, because I think it's the interesting gap. It measured what happens immediately after 9 minutes of fast cutting. It didn't measure whether children who watch a lot of it develop differently over years. And it didn't measure whether the effect fades in 15 minutes or an hour. It didn't compare it to other fast things that aren't television, a lively game, a busy playground, being read to at pace. Those are all questions you'd want answered before drawing any conclusion at all about whether the show is good or bad for anybody. And they weren't the questions this study was asking, because studies are small and specific. And that's how research actually works. The headline treated a narrow finding as a verdict. It wasn't a verdict. It was one honest, careful measurement of one thing. One small aside, because it's the sort of thing I find quietly funny. The comparison program in the study was Caillou. If you know Caillou, you'll know that it occupies a genuinely unique position in parental opinion, in that a very large number of adults appear to actively dislike it. There are entire online communities dedicated to how much people cannot stand that program. So the study's structure, reduced to its bones, is children watch the fast one, or they watch the one their parents hate, or they drew a picture. And the fast one came out worst on the tests. I'm not suggesting that it undermines anything. The methodology is sound, and the pacing difference is the variable that matters. It just amuses me that of all the slow-paced children's programs available in 2011, the control condition ended up being the one with a reputation. The drawing group is the part I'd actually want to know more about, incidentally. Those children spent 9 minutes with markers, and then did the tasks, and they did fine. Which is not surprising, but it does raise the mildly awkward question of what the baseline for a 4-year-old's attention actually is, and whether television is being measured against a fair comparison or against the single best possible use of 9 minutes. Speaking of academic papers about this show that got flattened into a headline, there's another one, and this one's about a real place. Bikini Atoll is in the Marshall Islands, out in the Central Pacific. It's a ring of coral around a lagoon, and it's about as remote as anywhere on Earth gets. Between the mid-1940s and the late 1950s, the United States used it as a nuclear weapons testing site. The people who lived there, the Bikinians, were moved off the atoll beforehand and told it was temporary. It wasn't. Attempts to resettle it have run into contamination problems repeatedly ever since, and the community remains displaced. That's a real history involving real people, and it's not obscure. It's well documented, and there's a substantial body of work on it. And the town in the cartoon is called Bikini Bottom. Right, let's do this one carefully, because I think it's the story in this whole video that's been reported worst. In 2019, around the show's 20th anniversary, a paper was published in a journal called The Contemporary Pacific, a journal of island affairs. It was written by Holly M. Barker, a principal lecturer in anthropology at the University of Washington, who has spent a large portion of her career working on the Marshall Islands. The title was Unsettling SpongeBob and the Legacies of Violence on Bikini Bottom. Her argument, as published, was roughly this: the show builds an enormously popular fictional world on top of a non-fictional homeland. Billions of people worldwide are familiar with Bikini Bottom. Almost none of them are familiar with Bikini Atoll. And that imbalance means the fiction has effectively displaced the history, the American nuclear testing program, and the Marshallese people themselves have dropped out of view for a global audience who now associate that name with a burger restaurant. She also raised some points about the balance of male and female characters, and about the name Bob functioning as a generic everyman. And then it left the journal. Fox News ran it. Then a very large number of outlets ran the same story, and the framing was consistent across all of them. A university professor has declared SpongeBob a violent, racist colonizer. That framing went absolutely everywhere. It hit talk radio, it hit comment sections, it hit the kind of blog that exists purely to be annoyed about universities. There were people writing limericks about it. There was a very great deal of noise for a paper in an island studies journal that would ordinarily be read by a few hundred specialists. On the 18th of October 2019, the University of Washington's Anthropology Department published a statement from Barker directly. She said reports in certain outlets had grossly oversimplified and mischaracterized the paper. She said plainly that her article does not say the character of SpongeBob is violent or racist. What it asks readers to do is consider the way the show's creation of a fictional world in a real homeland removes the American history of violence on that atoll and the Marshallese people from view. That is a substantially different claim from the one that got reported, and I think it's a much more reasonable one. Whether you find it persuasive is a separate question. You might read it and think it's asking a cartoon to carry more weight than a cartoon can carry, and that's a perfectly respectable position. But it's an argument about historical memory and what fiction does to it. It isn't a claim about the moral character of a sponge. The gap between what she wrote and what got reported is enormous, and I don't think it was an accident. Professor makes nuanced argument about historical erasure in popular media is not a story anyone clicks on. Professor calls SpongeBob racist is a story that runs itself. Same mechanism as the Dobson business, 14 years apart. The difference is that Dobson had a television slot to correct the record from, and a department statement doesn't, which is probably why almost nobody has heard her version, and quite a lot of people have heard his. There's one bit of context I'd want to add here, because I think it's genuinely relevant, and it rarely comes up in coverage of this. Stephen Hillenburg was a marine biologist. Properly, he studied marine science. He worked at an ocean institute. He taught marine biology before he ever worked in animation. The reason the show is set underwater is that he'd spent years teaching children about tide pools and sea creatures, and wanted to keep doing it in a different form. Everything about the show's design comes out of that. The character types are real organisms. The educational comic he made at the institute is where the whole thing started. The name almost certainly came from the association between bikini atolls and the tropical Pacific in general, filtered through a very silly pun about the bottom of a lagoon. There's no evidence anyone in that room in the 1990s was thinking about weapons testing. But Barker's point doesn't actually require that they were. That's the bit people missed. Her argument isn't that anyone did this on purpose. She says as much. She understands the writers weren't thinking about colonization. The argument is about the effect, not the intent. And those are separate things. You can disagree with it. I go back and forth on it, honestly. But it deserved a better hearing than it got. And instead, it got about 4 days of people yelling at a headline. Since we're on the subject of the atoll, there's a piece of internet folklore attached to it that comes up every time this topic does, and it's worth clearing up. The theory goes that Bikini Bottom is explicitly a nuclear test site, and that the characters are mutants, that the show is secretly about radiation, and that this explains a talking squirrel, a Texan accent underwater, and everything else that doesn't make sense. It's a fun theory. It's also entirely a fan invention. Nobody involved in the show has ever said anything of the sort, and the show's own explanations for its oddities are much simpler and much more in keeping with what it actually is. The squirrel is there because Hillenburg wanted a land animal in the water and thought the air helmet was funny, which is broadly the case for every dark hidden meaning theory about this program, and there are dozens. The 7 deadly sins? 1. The one about the characters representing various mental conditions. They're all constructed backwards from a show that was made by a marine science teacher who wanted children to think tide pools were interesting. I don't think there's anything wrong with the theories, incidentally. Making up elaborate secondary readings of children's television is a fine and ancient pastime, and I've done my share of it. I just distinguish between this is a fun idea I had and this is what the show's about, and the internet is not always brilliant at that distinction. Barker's paper, importantly, is not one of those theories. She isn't claiming a hidden meaning. She's claiming an unintended effect, which is a completely different kind of argument and a much more defensible one. There's a bit of context worth adding about the atoll itself, because it's the part most people genuinely don't know. 23 nuclear devices were detonated at Bikini between 1946 and 1958. The largest was a hydrogen bomb test in 1954 that turned out to be roughly 2.5 times more powerful than the scientists had predicted, and the fallout spread considerably further than anyone had planned for. Neighbouring atolls were affected. A Japanese fishing crew well outside the declared danger zone was exposed. The Bikinians were moved beforehand and were told they could return. Attempts at resettlement in the 1970s were reversed when it became clear the food grown there was still unsafe. The community is still displaced, several generations on. That's the history sitting underneath a word that most of the planet now associates with a cartoon burger restaurant. And whether or not you accept Barker's specific argument about what fiction does to memory, I think the underlying observation is just correct. Most people have heard the name, and almost nobody knows the history. I certainly didn't before I started reading for this, which is either an argument for her point or simply an argument that I should read more. And honestly, it might be both. There's a last thing I want to say about the coverage, and then I'll leave it. The reason a story like this one runs so easily is that it slots into an argument people were already having. There's a long-running row in a lot of countries about universities, about what gets studied there, and about whether academic work is serious. Any story that appears to show a professor saying something ridiculous is instantly useful to one side of that row, and it doesn't much matter whether the professor said it, so the paper didn't get read on its merits. It got read as evidence in a case that was already open, and the correction, a statement from a university department, posted on a university website, reached a fraction of the people who saw the original. That's just arithmetic. Corrections always lose. Everyone knows this, and nothing about it changes. What I'd take from it, practically, is a small habit that served me well while making these. When a story about an academic paper sounds too neat, go and look at the paper, or at minimum, go and look at whether the person has responded. It takes about 4 minutes, and it is astonishing how often the 4 minutes changes the story completely. That's not me being high-minded about it. I've been caught out by exactly this sort of thing more than once, which is precisely why I check now, which is, I suppose, as good a note as any to stop on. So, let's tot it up. 1 episode genuinely removed and left removed. 1 held back for 2 years and then quietly released, having aired elsewhere the whole time. 40 seconds cut from a third, which still plays in Canada and South Korea and a handful of other places, so half the world has a slightly different version of it than the other half. That's the complete list of things anyone actually did. Everything else in this video was an argument, a watchdog group in 2001, a petition in 2010 that nothing came of, a newspaper in 2013 finding politics in an episode about a burger, a dinner speech in 2005 that got compressed into a sentence its speaker never said, a commission in Ukraine that met, considered, and then ceased to exist, a very long, very sad disagreement about what a man would have wanted, held between people who will miss him, a psychology paper about editing rhythm that turned into a headline about ruined children, and an anthropology paper about historical memory that turned into a headline about a racist sponge. The thing that struck me most while putting this together is how rarely any of it was about the show. The show is mostly just there. It's a cartoon about a sponge who's inexplicably delighted to be flipping burgers, made by a marine biologist who wanted children to find the ocean interesting, and it's been running long enough that entire arguments have been fought across it, like it's a field somebody happened to build a battle on, which I suppose is what happens when something gets big enough. It stops being a program and becomes a surface. People project onto it, argue over it, use it to make points about things it has nothing to do with. There's no version of being that popular for that long where this doesn't happen to you. I genuinely recommend going back and watching some of the early ones, if you haven't in a while. Not the controversial ones, just the ordinary ones. There's a real craft in them that's easy to miss when you're 8 and easier to appreciate when you're not. Something I noticed while writing all this, which I hadn't expected, there's no villain anywhere in it. I went in half expecting to find one. A network behaving badly, a writer's room being careless, a group deliberately stirring something up for attention. And there are moments in each of those directions, certainly. But mostly what I found was a lot of people making defensible decisions from where they were standing, and those decisions colliding in ways nobody intended. The standards reviewer who pulled an episode was doing the job they were hired to do. The researcher who published a small, careful study was doing science correctly. The fans who wrote petitions were upset about something real. The showrunner who called a spin-off greedy was defending a friend. Even the reporters who flattened the papers into headlines were, in a grim professional sense, doing exactly what their industry rewards. That's less satisfying than a story with someone to be annoyed at, and I suspect it's why almost none of these get told this way, but it's what's actually there. The other thing I'd note is how many of these hinge on a gap between what somebody said and what everybody heard. That's true of the 2005 dinner speech, it's true of the 2011 study, it's true of the 2019 paper, and it's arguably true of the disagreement over what a man said about spin-offs before he died. 4 completely unrelated situations, same failure mode every time. I don't think there's a fix for that, particularly. It's just how information moves once enough people are handling it. The simplest version wins because the simplest version is the easiest to repeat, and repetition is what makes something true in practice, regardless of whether it's true in fact. Which is a slightly gloomy note to be landing on for a video about a cartoon sponge, so let me put something else next to it. The show is still good. That's the bit that keeps getting lost in all this. Underneath every argument in this video is a genuinely well-made program that has given an extraordinary number of people an extraordinary amount of pleasure for a very long time, and none of the fighting has damaged it in the slightest. It's all still there. Every episode we've talked about tonight, and hundreds we haven't, most of which are just funny and have never caused anybody any trouble at all. I've got a few more of these in mind. There's a whole video's worth in television episodes that got shelved because the world did something inconvenient the same month they were finished, and I keep meaning to get to it. But that's the lot for tonight. Thanks for having me on in the background.